Our generation, Antonia, we are from the Gen X generation. We're also a very middle child generation, metaphorically speaking. Like we are between two very big dominant generations. The baby boomers, our parents' generation, and that entire cohort, and millennials, that entire big generation and that cohort. And it sometimes feels like, I would think you would experience this, many Gen Xers experience that. We feel caught in between these two generations that are seemingly at odds with each other. They have a weird kind of love-hate relationship with each other often.
Oh, boomers and millennials?
Yes.
Yeah, they do. They do have a weird love-hate relationship.
Yeah.
And I think it's not just that we're the middle child, we're sort of the ignored child. Nobody really pays attention to Gen Xers.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So I'm noticing in the world there's a lot of tension and hostilities at the time of this recording. I mean, there's always tension and hostilities in the world, but it feels very intense right now at the time of this recording. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I was watching people online battle, talking back and forth, or people having conversations and having different desires and different outcomes that they're driving. And I'm looking at this going, I really notice a split between young people and older people in how they're approaching the things that they want to happen in life. And I noticed that when older people are online talking and conversing and putting forth their ideas and desires, they're often protecting their personal past. So, for example, they're protecting the things maybe they've built, the career they've built, the wealth they've built, the connections, the legacy they've built, the prestige they've built. They want to protect everything that they've been doing up until now. And so a lot of the desires that they put forth are protection desires to keep what they have, to keep and preserve what is there. And often young people, it's the reverse. It's young people are protecting their future, all the potentiality that's coming down the road. So they're looking at things that are going to mess up or disrupt possible future building of a life that's to come. And just those two frameworks in mind, like if you just approach most conversations, looking at somebody saying, okay, what station of life are they in? Are they more on the older side of life where they're preserving something that's come before? Or are they on the younger side of life? They're preserving something that's coming down the road. This could probably give us a good framework to understand why people show up the way they do and what creates the tensions that we're seeing all around us.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like I'm right between them.
I would agree.
Yeah.
I feel the same way.
I think that's the crazy thing about midlife is all of a sudden, one moment you're like, oh, wait a minute, I guess I don't have endless amounts of time. What is the thing that I'm going to leave as a legacy for this world?
Yeah.
And at the same time, I don't really feel like I'm not thinking about the future at all. I still have plenty of it in front of me. I mean, fingers crossed. So yeah, it feels like I'm in this really interesting midlife, right? Midpoint. And so, yeah, I feel like I can see both sides of this.
Well, and to add to that, being in the middle child of life age groups, our generation, Antonia, we are from the Gen X generation. We're also a very middle child generation, metaphorically speaking. Like we are between two very big dominant generations. The baby boomers, our parents' generation, and that entire cohort, and millennials, that entire big generation and that cohort. And it sometimes feels like, I would think you would experience this, many Gen Xers experience that. We feel caught in between these two generations that are seemingly at odds with each other. They have a weird kind of love-hate relationship with each other often.
Oh, boomers and millennials?
Yes.
Yeah, they do. They do have a weird love-hate relationship.
Yeah.
And I think it's not just that we're the middle child, we're sort of the ignored child. Nobody really pays attention to Gen Xers. I took a screenshot one time of something that was trending on social media about Gen Xers. And it said at the bottom, trending with boomers. It was an article about Gen X, but it wasn't acknowledged that it was trending with Gen Xers. It was trending with other people. And so I'm like, oh, that's why it's trending, because somehow it caught the attention of boomers. And so now it's trending. So it's it's an interesting sort of bridge experience. And what's interesting about it too, beyond it just being a bridge and this sort of middle child syndrome, is that right now you're seeing Gen Xers really step into positions of leadership. I think maybe really truly becoming an influential generation, possibly for the first time, right?
Yeah.
Like having true legit. We've always had influence on some level, but it's always been very, very quiet. But right now, Gen Xers are in the forefront of things and getting themselves in a fair bit of trouble at the same time.
Yeah, they're not just, I don't think our generation is necessarily just stepping into leadership. We're also stepping into independence. So a lot of people in our generation, I've noticed, are like leaving their journalism jobs at the New York Times to go write on Substack. At the time of this recording, that's a huge platform for email newsletters. So people are becoming independent, and they're setting up almost little one-woman shops here and there. And they're creating an independent spirit of moving through the world and independent voices and pushing forth this kind of independence framework, this individualism framework, which is very much at odds, I would say, with kind of the ethos that's in the air in the world right now.
Yeah, the zeitgeist likes a more community feel. Like it's the zeitgeist to be, like, no, we're all in this together. And Xers themselves tend to be a more independent generation in general. And that comes from almost the marrow of them. And so they're the ones who are reminding the zeitgeist of the importance of a more independent streak. And neither one is the superior way of going about things.
Yeah.
Both the community aspect, the in this together aspect, and the individualism. I mean, this is sort of the challenge with reality, is that it's built on paradoxes. And the paradox is that both are equally important and both need to be represented simultaneously. And so when one side is, dominant in its energy or in its messaging or in its agenda or whatever you want to call it, right? Its intentions and motivations are the thing that is the energy we tend to get caught up with, then the other side has to fight. It has to fight for representation. It has to fight to remind people of its importance. And then when we're in a more independent time period, which we get into these time periods and cycles and seasons, and when we're in a more independent time period, that's when people who are more community oriented, more we're in this together, that's when they have to fight. And so right now we just happen to be in a time period where Xers and the more independent streak are the ones who are the outliers that are fighting to represent that very important reality alongside the other reality of the more community feel.
Yeah. So we take the concept of kind of older, younger, maybe there's a middle generation, and just like everything we do here at Personality Hacker, our attempt is to create more fidelity in understanding the frameworks that we see the world through. So we do this with personality types, right? We take the idea of personality types. And in fact, on the last episode, we talked about how we move from stereotypes and meme understanding of type, of personality, something we might see on the internet on a social media post and resonate with. And like, oh, that's just, those 5 characteristics are just like me, all the way up to deep work with archetypal energy and Jungian cognitive functions, dips into shadow work. There's a bunch of things that can be unpacked on a timeline of understanding about personality type. Mm-hmm. And our work here at Personality Hacker has often been helping create frameworks to understand, sort that information, sort that understanding, learn more about the self, and understand ourselves through the lens of particular systems like Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram and other systems like that. Well, I think we could bring some understanding also to generations and people groups at age levels, different age groups of people. There's probably some more fidelity we can use here as well. And this would require us to bring in generational theory. Mm-hmm. And we have a particular model of generational theory that we've already talked about on this show multiple times, years past. It might be even 5 years ago at this point.
It's been a minute.
Approaching.
Yeah.
So you can go look up some of those episodes where we have Jesse Newbern, who brought some thinking around this to the table. But I wanted to revisit that today. Mm-hmm. Maybe offer just another relook at this. Mm-hmm. Let's resurface this idea of generational theory. And what does it help us understand about our world and our movement forward as all generations, as all people?
Yep.
No matter our personality type.
Yep. And I love generational theory. I really do. I unapologetically love the theory. And I should also note that it's just a model, just like all the other models. And one of my favorite quotes about models is that all models are untrue or false, but some models are useful. And this is one that I find very useful, but it's also touchy. People don't like the idea of putting generations into any sort of model or archetypes. I've noticed that it's almost like this, there's a reluctance to see an entire group of people who were born at approximately the same time period as having any sort of definable characteristics. And yet, isn't that basically what culture is? Yeah. Culture is built of people who were all alive at the same time, receiving similar messaging, similar, influences in their life. And so there's imprints that end up happening at that time period that get sort of etched in as part of a way of looking at the world, a way of looking at reality, part of your paradigm, whether you're conscious or not, right? Or consciously aware of it or not. So I don't think that this is like a personality type system like other systems are that indicate how we're sort of pre-wired to be fascinated by certain things. This is more of a nurture than nature model. It's more like, okay, what time period were you alive during at certain very key moments in your life? And how did that influence you and all the people who were alive in approximately that age bracket, in approximately that time period? How did it, help craft how you see reality? And there seems to be some patterns to that. There seems to be some enough pattern recognition in all of that to be able to create a 500-year cyclical theory of generational theory. And I think it's well worth going over, particularly since we're in a time period, like you mentioned, of tension, of, oh God, is it the end? Is this all going to crash and burn? And if you look at even the current zeitgeist through the lens of generational theory, it's predicted. This is a time period that we just have to get through. And we've been here before and we'll be here again. I mean, fingers crossed. I guess one of these times could take us all out. I mean, fingers crossed it won't. But these are cycles. And so I have found actually great, relief in generational theory.
Yeah.
Even if it's not empirically true, it reminds me of spirals. It reminds me of, just kind of being in these cyclical, seasons where people go through sort of archetypal patterns, find themselves in similar positions as they found themselves before, and then look at all of the time periods we've been there before and the ways that we overcame them or survived them, making it so that we're very likely to do it again.
Mm-hmm. So there's two ways to approach this. There's the news media common zeitgeist narrative way. And I see like news media just kind of applies generational labels random. This is Gen Z. This is, whatever, Gen X. This is millennial. They just kind of throw, the numbers are all over the place. There's no consistency to it. It's just whatever media outlet has decided this generation is, and they kind of just loosely group them. I don't think that's a very good social science approach. Now, I don't know if the model that we really like is from the social sciences. I think it is, but it feels more social science approach to me. It feels like it's got a little bit more of a methodology to it and a framework than just a news media label. So most people engage with generational theory or generation types through the news media model, and we're not going to address that at all right now. We're going to actually address a real model that we use in-house here at Personality Hacker.
Yeah, well, I mean, this model isn't verifiable either, but I think that it has enough legs and enough, information or research behind it. Not research as in like,
well, they publish books. I mean, they publish articles and books for years.
Yeah, for like basically the last 30 years. Yeah. And I think it has enough legs under it to be able to be, again, regardless of whether or not it's empirically true, it's very useful. Throwing around, this generation was born in this time period, maybe. Here's the approximate, and having a very, sort of slapdash way of going about it. I don't think the journalists have put, the due diligence into it either. So I find that most of the pushback against generational theory is that it feels almost fatalistic, which I don't think it is, but I think a lot of times there's some pushback against that. The original thing that I mentioned, which is that people don't like the idea that their behavior or paradigms can be predictably patterned based on the time period in which they live, which the people just don't like that they're predictable. I think that's what that comes down to. Yeah. And then I think finally there's an idea that it's not empirically true. but models aren't intended to be empirically true. They're intended to be maps and waypoints and an observation of how cycles work. So I think it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump into it. You
Okay.
want to take a stab at explaining kind of the basic framework, the overarching framework?
Yeah. Okay. So generational theory comes originally from Neil Howe and William Strauss. And I believe William Strauss is since passed on. But they were effectively watching cycles of human behavior sort of pop up over and over and over again through the lens of what ended up becoming the word secular crisis, or this concept of secular crisis. And there seems to be these secular crisis points that sort of basically run into each other approximately every 80 years. Now, there's not 100% accuracy to that, but it's approximately every 80 years we find ourselves in sort of a similar zeitgeisty time period. And zeitgeist is just sort of the energy of the time period. And when they were doing this research, they found that there seems to be what they call 4 archetypal energies that keep cycling through humans every generation. Every generation is part of this 4-cycle archetypal generational pattern that keeps showing up over and over again. So that's sort of the first concept, is that there's four archetypal patterns that show up over and over and over and over again. Then they also noticed that part of what creates that archetypal pattern is that they're born during certain time periods of history. And those could be called seasons, 4 seasons. So your archetypal energy isn't just randomly assigned to you based on one of these 4 generations. It's that you're actually born during a certain time period that influences why you show up with this archetypal energy. So there's 4 different generations that experience 4 quote unquote seasons in different time periods of their life, influential time periods. What was the season that humans were going through when you were born and you were coming of age? What was the season when you were now establishing your young adulthood? What was the season when you hit midlife? And what was the season of your elderhood? This informs sort of a bunch of things about how you're going to see reality.
So just to clarify and just make sure that we're following along here, in an 80-year span, roughly 80 years, give or take a few years here and there, but in a general sense, 80-year time span, that's not a season. There are 4 seasons inside that 80-year time span.
Right.
And 4 archetypical energies that are birthed inside of those seasons that occur in that 80-year time span.
Right, exactly. The 80-year time span, they've assigned the name a saculum. So that 80 years is a full saculum, and it has 4 different 20-year seasons within it. So a saculum starts with spring, and then, of course, spring is followed by summer. Summer is followed by fall or autumn, and then finally the cusp is winter. And then the next saculum starts once winter is complete. And spring, summer, fall, and winter, these 20-year spans, all of them have certain markers to them. So spring is a high. It's a time period of rebuilding for people. When humans are in a time period of spring, everything feels like it can be hopeful, right? It's hopeful. It's like it's all going to be okay.
Yeah.
And there's approximately a 20-year time period when that, like, people in the zeitgeist kind of feel like it's going to be all right. Then it's followed by summer. And summer is a time period of spiritual awakening. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a positive kumbaya style. Sometimes spiritual awakenings are quite violent, right? They're like time periods of protest, or like, we're not going to take this anymore. But it's oftentimes summer is, I know, just in reality, summer is a time period where you can not have to worry so much about where you're going to get your next meal or how you're going to shelter yourself. It's a time period where you have a little bit more space to go inward and do some introspection.
So this time period would be abundant energy in the world. There'd be abundance, opportunity, possibly wealth, or the ability for wealth generation or upward mobility during this time period.
Yeah, exactly. Like we came from that high of spring, and it put us in an introspective place, a time period of basically resource abundance. And then it's followed by fall or autumn, which is it's an unraveling. So the unraveling doesn't have to necessarily look like, like everything is crashing down. But the spiritual awakening encouraged people to start looking at their institutions And so now it's a time period where new things are starting to be given some credence and credibility. Maybe we don't want it to be set up this way. Maybe we actually want it to be set up this other way. And so the high of spring, whatever got established in spring, as these are our institutions as a culture, they start to be replaced. They start to be sort of reevaluated almost in a slow way during autumn, but it's also a time period of harvest. So now we're not yet seeing challenge in a big way. We're just basically experiencing what happens when you navel gaze for a while and you want to start, out with the old and with the new in more of an institution or technological way.
Yeah.
And then finally, it culminates in winter. And winter is a time period of secular crisis. So if summer is a spiritual awakening, then winter is a secular crisis time period. And that's when things really start to crash and burn. That's when institutions really start to collapse. And it's a time period, as opposed to summer of abundance, it's a time period of scarcity. And just like in any winter time period, you're going to be a little bit more xenophobic. You're going to be a little bit, less sharing with others. You're going to see enemies where maybe they actually aren't, because you're wanting to make sure that you're protecting your resource. You're going to be a little bit more focused on you and yours, as opposed to a more open, sort of generous frame. And you're going to do a lot less navel gazing, right? Because you don't have time for it. This is now a time period of scarcity. It's not a time period of abundance. So winter is the culmination or the ending of the saeculum. Yeah. And in previous 80-year spans and previous saeculums, the theory is that it almost always ends in what they call total war. So like a previous version of this would have been 1945. That would have been the end of the previous saeculum. And that was the culmination of World War II. And then the previous saeculum ended in the Civil War. And then if you just keep going back...
In this country in the United States.
In this country in the United States, right. And you keep going back and you see like the Revolutionary War. This is a pretty... this is very centered on the United States. I think that there are some components that touch on all of Western culture, but it's primarily looking at, first and foremost, the culture of North America.
So let's just take this for the most recent history to move from theory just to look at real life for a moment. So winter, the culmination, let's just look at recent history, the last winter cycle, total war, World War II, I think we could all agree is total war, literally World War II. We're fighting on a global scale. 1941 through 1945 was the United States involvement, but the war had been going on before that.
Sure.
Germany invaded Poland in 1939. So it was like a long period of time of like a lot of turmoil, a lot of upheaval. United States enters the war. The war concludes in 1945, and winter winds down, and now spring is on the rise. At least, again, we're coming from an American-centric viewpoint here. So, but even in Europe, there was a renewal and rebirth. You had to rebuild Europe after the devastation of World War II. Mm-hmm. So there's this springtime, there's a rebuilding, and there's a setting of new codes, new cultural, new moral codes, new ways of being. We're not going to do anything that got us to the place of that war we just came from.
Ostensibly, right?
I mean, this is the idea, right? The theory in the air is we're going to do new things. So we're going to set things right this time. So we're going to let's get everybody on board. Let's get cohesive. We'll do an us first them, like people over there. We're going to be standing for our values. This is in the 1950s here in the United States where the Red Scare came, right? We're not communist. We're capitalist. We're American freedom loving, whatever. And anybody, like, there's no room for dissent around that. Mm-hmm. People were canceled left and right if you were even suspected to be a communist at that time. So this is that spring starting to kick, right? They're trying to establish the rules, establish the frame. But then the 1960s, late 60s and 70s come along, and that summertime of a spiritual awakening happens now. So we're seeing people that have rigid rules and this is how it's going to be. And then it's the next generation, the baby boomers are, I don't know, is this really the values? They start to navel gaze and say, is this the spiritual tone we want to have? All this structure, institution, and these set one size fits all values. Maybe there's more flexibility. And so there's this spiritual awakening in both religions and outside of religions, both a spiritual element, but also religious awakening. There's a lot of religious movements that sprang up and started to really move forward in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think that with a lot of religions, I think they had peak attendance and a lot of them had peak sort of new converts during that time period. And in a secular way, there were like things like the human potential movement that really got going during that time period. And so you can tell it was a time period of like personal growth became a big deal, and new ways of looking at child rearing, and new ways of like feminism came on the scene, and the civil rights movement. And again, it wasn't necessarily all fun and games. I mean, it was serious business.
Resets happening.
But it was like, what kind of people do we really want to be as a culture?
Yeah.
And so it's almost like a collective introspection during that spiritual awakening time period.
So that moves into the 1980s and then into the 1990s, where autumn and fall starts to come on the scene. And there's a harvest. I think economically, at least here in the United States, the 1990s were a boom time. The internet was being created. There was a bunch of reaping what was sowed maybe 30 years before economically. Now, again, there's a global framework here, and I'm generally overvaluing the United States perspective. I'm not taking all world things into account clearly for the sake of this conversation.
Right.
But in general, there's a harvest time period. It's kind of a continuation of that reevaluation in the 60s and 70s, where a lot of things like recycling went into place. Like some of the values that were created in the 60s and 70s became codified in the 1990s and the early 2000s, like into the 2000s.
Yeah. Well, and I think the 80s and 90s had things like culture wars. A lot of culture wars were coming on the scene during that time period.
Yeah.
And the tech bubble, right? Like that now is a game changer. It starts to, just because of its existence, not necessarily because it has a will, but just because it exists, the hockey sticking of technology made it so that previous institutions were going to start unraveling. They couldn't help it because now there was just like a new way of doing things. And then that was also the time period where there was like a war on terror, even though that phrase didn't really pick up until the early aughts, right? 2001 after 9/11. All during the 90s, there was a ton of terrorism attacks. Yeah. And that was a catchphrase. It was like a war on terror. And so there was a lot of unraveling going on during that time period, even though it was a time period of economic boom in the 90s.
Yeah. And so then we start to enter winter, the winter season. And I think if you're listening to this podcast near the time it was recorded, you're already, if you're thinking of archetypical energies and energies around you, you probably identify like, yeah, maybe we are in the middle of a wintry time period, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah.
Like in winter, what happens? You get more constricted with your energy. You take less risks. You don't go out as much. You hoard more of your resource. You're not as free with it. You stay close to the people you know, like all of these things, because it's a tough time. It's hard for people, and they're having a challenge in that time period. And then there's a lot of hostilities, a lot of tensions, and it's that secular crisis that's coming to reevaluate the values of society, but not through a spiritual awakening. Like, look at what's possible. It's like, this can't stand anymore. We have to destroy it and reset. And often, like we've said, it leads to total war in the past in these cycles. Yeah.
Well, we're in the secular crisis right now, and you can tell. I mean, it's been going on for a while, but it's definitely reached high points. Maybe it has already reached, like it feels kind of like it peaks and then goes down a little bit and then peaks again and then goes down a little bit. But as long as we're at the tail end of winter, it's never going to go down to a point where maybe people of our age remember it being.
Yeah.
Like if you talk to people who are old enough to have a lot of conscious memories of culture in the 90s, this is a totally different world.
Yeah.
This is a completely different game we're playing. And the idea that we can't talk about politics anymore without somebody effectively, deciding that they don't want to have a relationship with the person who's on the other side anymore.
Yeah, that's insane.
Well,
from our past, like that's just nuts.
Yeah, it was never like that before, but all of a sudden it feels that way, and that's what winter does. Winter makes it puts us in a time period of scarcity. It puts us in a time period of ideological scarcity. It makes it so that everything feels like it's all in with your chips, and everything feels like it's a big deal. And there are no molehills anymore. There's only mountains. Because when you're traveling in winter, everything is a stretch. Everything is more difficult than it would have been at any other time period. So everything feels difficult. And that's the characteristic of winter. And one of the reasons why I like generational theory is that it predicted a lot of the things that we're experiencing now at the end of winter. It predicted them back in the 90s. And it's because these are the things that people experience at this time in the saeculum. It just is. So we're at the tail end of winter. Well, tail end, We don't know
How
necessarily
long is this tail?
how long the tail is going to be. And if these things were cut and dry, it would be approximately 2025 would be the very end of winter. But everything, I think it was Neil Strauss who said, or no, excuse me, not Neil Strauss. He unfortunately is, Neil Howe, excuse me, and William Strauss. It was Neil Howe who said, because our life cycles are getting longer and we're extending everything, we're extending young adulthood, we're extending middle age, everything is extending. He said that it's probably that the seasons are also going to dilate. So winter would have been over approximately 2025, but we'll see if it stretches into, much later than that, into like maybe 2030. But regardless, you can kind of feel like on an archetypal energetic level that we're in a time period that feels like winter. It feels like a secular crisis. It feels like things are not, like we're at the batten down the hatches. We only have so much food. Like, don't share with anybody because we can't afford it. And it is the opposite of a time period of generosity.
And we say that as a metaphor, but there are people around the world right now that are experiencing that at the time of this recording in a very real way. Batten down the hatches. We don't have enough heat. We don't have enough food. We're in a scarcity mode and we're going to just get through, like very literally. So it can be a real challenge. This model speaks to me because it's like, man, this is very predictive, or at least it's descriptive. It feels predictive to me. I will mention too that a saculum, that 80-year span, roughly 80 years, that's roughly about the lifespan of a person. Like one person's life, if they live into old age and die of natural causes, they usually live, if they're in relatively good health, to about 80-ish years old, give or take. Probably 10 years around that.
Yeah, it's a good life. 80 years is even still now is a pretty good life.
Yeah, and that's the average life expectancy-ish. I mean, I don't know if it's the average, but that's kind of the expected average life expectancy of somebody that lives a relatively healthy life. I was going to start to steer us into talking about the actual generational energy, the archetypes of the generations, but I'm realizing just laying the foundation, it took a while, and this might go really long because we want to give it its proper time.
Right.
So why don't we put a pause in this? Let's come back in the next episode and pick up where we left off, a part 2, and talk about those generational energies that show up.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea because this will go probably for an hour and a half if we just continue on. And so before we close this one down, though, before we conclude this, what I'm guessing is now part 1 of our generational theory podcasts, I do want to mention that as we're talking about the saculum and these different seasons, one of the things that I've really appreciated about learning about generational theory is knowing that this fourth time period, they actually call each of these seasons a turning. So the spring is the first turning, summer is the second turning, fall or autumn is a third turning, and winter is a fourth turning. And in fact, that's the name of their book, The Fourth Turning, because that's the time period that they were predicting when they wrote the book in the 90s. It's the time period that we are really experiencing the sort of the pressure of right now because we're at the end of this fourth turning. And knowing that we've been here before, right? Like this is not something that's new to us. We've experienced these fourth turnings cyclically for who knows how long. The book Generations, which is the first book that they wrote, traces these turnings back to the 1500s. So this is something that we've not just experienced over the last couple hundred years, we've experienced them who knows how many times. And so we just need to get through it. We've gotten through it before. We've gotten through winter or a fourth turning before. It's always a horrible time period. It's a time period of scarcity. It's a time period of xenophobia. It's a time period of not feeling like anything's going to be okay. It's a time period that quote unquote ends in total war. Like it's not fun times.
Yeah.
And we can get to the other side of it. So even if you don't understand anything about the generations themselves and the archetypal energies of the generations themselves, just looking at this idea of a saculum, of a time period, of an age, and seeing these patterns that we go through a high, and then we go through a spiritual awakening from that high, and then we go through an unraveling from the spiritual awakening, and then we go through a secular crisis from the unraveling, and then we get through the secular crisis and we get back into a high. Just knowing that that's kind of a cycle of humans and human culture, that helped me a lot. It helped me go, you're right. You're right. This is a spiral. This is a situation that's cyclical.
Yeah.
And unless we hit a big red button that says, nuke all humans, we're going to get through it and we're going to be okay on the other side.
So what's coming up for you as you're listening along? We're talking about these generational seasons, this saculum. Does this resonate with you? Have you found yourself seeing these energies? You're like, oh yeah, I kind of identify that energy. I get that in my life. I can understand that. I see my parents or my grandparents and those energy. I kind of understand how maybe that influenced our world. We want to hear from you. You haven't had a microphone this entire time, but now's the time to come and make your voice heard. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. What's coming up in your life from maybe a story, something you remember. We want to hear from you.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. And of course, this is also a video podcast on YouTube. So find the channel Personality Hacker, like, subscribe, and hit that little bell that lets you know when a new episode comes out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have a suite of programs that is personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. And might I recommend one of the personality type owner's manuals. They are designed to help you begin an owner's manual, not just for your personality type, but for who you are as a person. Right? We don't come with an owner's manual, so we have to make one ourselves. And the owner's manuals are designed to get you going and have an access point to get inside your psychology, how you're pre-wired, so that you can look at the phenomena that you're showing up with and ask yourself, is this how I want to be acting? Is this how I want to show up in the world? How do I get to the best version of myself? So head over to personalityhacker.com and find the owner's manual for your best fit type.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker